Hello guys, and welcome to another video. So today I'm just going to be talking about some really popular defensive setups and kind of comparing the most popular defensive setups in the game in this patch and some emerging defensive setups that have become apparent with some new additions. So it's worth noting before I start that the investment level on these different defensive setups is quite different. Some of the really high investment setups are going to be very strong, obviously, but they take a lot to actually get the setup running, and before they actually get there, the defense is kind of lackluster. So there are some really cheap setups that you can use that are very powerful until you're able to fully invest into some of those things. Let's take a look at some of the most effective defensive setups in this patch. There are several competing defensive setups. One of the most notable ones in this league is the use of the 4th VOW, new unique body armor, in combination with Divine Flesh. So this body armor, you've probably seen it, a lot of people have started to use it. It is a armor energy shield base, and it provides a very important stat. Armor also applies to chaos damage taken from hits. Now, this stat here is ridiculously strong when you think about it, because the only other stat that in the game where this kind of applies the full armor defense onto another damage type is Transcendence, and Transcendence comes with some huge downsides. But this armor's downside is kind of non-existent. There's one downside on the body armor, and it says physical damage taken bypasses energy shield. Well, this is not really a downside, because to make full use of this body armor, you're going to have to use the Keystone Divine Flesh. And Divine Flesh comes with a downside that says all damage taken bypasses energy shield. Therefore, energy shield becomes fairly useless other than using it for mana and mana cost of skills. When these two components are combined together, essentially what's going to happen is whenever you take an elemental damage hit, the damage is first going to go through the resistances, so half will be taken by an elemental resistance and half will be taken through your chaos resistance. And then the half that's taken through chaos is going to be fully defended by your armor thereafter. So if you had 50,000 armor, let's say, and you take a hit of fire damage, well, half of that fire damage is going to be defended using your fire resistance, and the other half is going to be defended using your chaos resistance. And then after it's been reduced from chaos resistance, the armor will then be applied. That's why this stat is so powerful, because the higher your resistance is, the more damage that it's mitigated through resistance, and that therefore the more effective your armor is at mitigating the damage further. This is really strong when you consider that damage taken as another type loses its initial properties such as penetration. So taking half of the damage as another type and then reducing it further with armor is very strong. And this defensive setup only requires 2 components, and it's not really much of a downside using this body armor. You do lose the Eldritch Implicits, which is obviously quite a big thing, because the Eldritch Implicits of body armor are very strong. Some aura effects and things like that, or max resistances. And of course, this body armor doesn't have any life on it, and also it has a life modifier with the regenerate 3% of life per second. So that does mean that you're not going to be able to make use of the 15% maximum life mastery that was added in this patch either. So there is a few little downsides there, but defensively, this setup is really strong. So the next setup we're looking at is being used much less often, but it's still quite effective, and it's very similar. And this setup uses Incandescent Heart. Now, Incandescent Heart is a body armor that's been in the game for a long time. What this body armor has is a modifier on it that says 25% of elemental damage from hits is taken as chaos damage. Now, if you combine this with Divine Flesh, you're going to be taking 75% of elemental damage from hits as chaos damage. And there's a new mastery that's been added in this patch. It's an armor and energy shield mastery. 10% of your armor is applied to chaos damage taken from hits. So that means that you're able to stack a bunch of armor, and similar to how Juggernaut's Unbreakable node applies a small percentage of armor to elemental damage taken, this setup will provide 10% of your armor to the chaos damage you take. All that damage that you're taking is going to be a huge amount of chaos, because instead of 50% with the previous setup, this is 75%. Now, this setup is particularly effective against hits with huge amounts of penetration. really, really strong against the hits that have a lot of penetration, because all of that penetration is going to be gone on the 75% that you take as chaos. Obviously, the actual damage mitigation is going to be a little bit lower because you're not using your full amount of armor to mitigate against that defense. But in this setup in particular, I think it's quite effective if you're able to increase your chaos resistance by a large quantity. And it's pretty easy to get quite a high amount of chaos resistance just by using Divine Flesh. You'll already be at 80. You're able to get some different cluster jewels, and there's a shield mod. In this patch in particular, there's actually a mod that you can get on Crucible passive trees that provides 4% of max chaos resistance, and it only gives you a -1% to all elemental resistances. So that's actually pretty strong. And that trade-off, obviously that trade-off is going to be very much worth it if you have a setup that converts 75% of elemental damage taken from hits into chaos. So if you're able to get your chaos resistance anywhere near 90% with this setup, it's going to be extremely effective because, of course, even though you're defending with a smaller amount of armor compared to the previous setup, if you're able to lower that hit by a huge amount, such as 90%, then your armor is going to be very, very effective against that. So this is a setup which is being used less than the 4th VOW, and I think that's fair because the 4th VOW setup is very, very strong, but this is still a very, very good defensive setup. And another setup that we're going to look at is the full Transcendence setup. Now this is one of the higher investment setups that I was talking about earlier. This one is pretty much the top end of defenses when it comes to making a character be able to tank huge amounts of damage. We've typically seen this setup on Pathfinder. There's a few other ascendancies that can do it as well, but Pathfinder seems to be the main one. And that's because you can convert a lot of the damage that you're taking from physical hits into elemental damage. So what is this setup? Well, we use a Transcendence Keystone, and this Keystone says armor applies to fire, cold, and lightning damage taken from hits instead of physical damage. And then there's a downside of -15% to all maximum elemental resistances. Now, this Keystone actually has two downsides. The first is that it, of course, provides that hefty negative max resistance penalty. But then it also makes it so that our armor no longer works against physical damage. So to overcome these downsides, you need to do a few things. You can either try to increase your max resistance through other methods such as on the tree and through gear, or you could use a item such as Lore Weave. That's what most builds using Transcendence use, to ignore the downside of the max resistances. But you need to be able to mitigate that physical damage. And most builds try to get around 100% or nearly 100% of physical damage from hits shifted into another damage type. This is usually elemental, and you do this through things like Taste of Hate. You can get a helmet that has 10%. That modifier drops from Betrayal, and it also comes from Delve as well. And you can also apply a implicit from Eldritch modifiers to further improve that. I think you can get around 18% on a helmet. The Taste of Hate flask provides 15% baseline. That can be scaled up with flask effect as well. But ultimately, you want to get nearly 100% or around that amount of physical damage taken from hits as elemental damage, and then you're going to be extremely tanky against pretty much every hit that comes in, except for chaos damage already, and there's not that much chaos damage, pure chaos damage in the game. There's also other ways, of course, to defend against physical damage. If you can't get to 100%, or let's say you're around 60 or 70% of physical damage from hits taken as another damage type, and you want to try and not die to that last 30 or 40%, well, you can stack some physical damage reduction. That still works. Things like endurance charges and the physical damage reduction that you can get on shields, for example. Also, you could get sort of less damage taken modifiers for physical damage, such as Arctic armor. But there are some other ways to do it, but the main way is to get that full conversion going. And that's very expensive, but this defensive setup can be extremely powerful once you have it going, because basically any damage type that you take, other than chaos, is going to be first mitigated through your resistances and then mitigated by all of your armor. The setup really only struggles against damage over time, so there's other ways you can solve that as well. But obviously, very, very strong defensive setup against one-shots. Other than these three setups, there are some other defensive setups that we probably should talk about. There's some emerging defensive setups that are coming out from this patch in particular. The most notable one, I would say, is the use of the Strength of Blood Keystone. With the addition of Instant Leech in 3.21, this Keystone becomes something that you can actually use. Before, it was kind of difficult to use, and there are still a lot of restrictions on how exactly you can use this Keystone. But how this Keystone works is it essentially no longer provides you with the life recovery from Leech, but that life recovery from the Leech is converted into less damage taken. So this modifier only applies when you're actually leeching. If you can find a way to have permanent uptime on Leech, such as Soul Tether or Slayer for example, or using Petrified Blood, if you're able to find a way to continuously leech without getting your Leech capped off and stopping, you're able to get this massive damage reduction coming in. It's a less damage taken modifier that can be scaled up very high. You can actually scale this up to even 40% less damage taken. And what's very strong about this modifier in particular is that it also works against damage over time. And a lot of the other modifiers that we've just talked about in the other defensive setups don't work against damage over time. And that makes this setup very, very strong. It also works against all damage types, which is particularly effective. But as I said, there are a lot of restrictions on actually how you could use this. So it's kind of in a similar vein to the Transcendence setup. It has a higher investment. Alright, so let's take a look at some comparisons for how effective each of these setups are. In these examples, we're going to just approximate that each setup has about 50,000 armor, and I've given each setup some resistances based on how I believe you would likely invest your resources. So the fourth VOW setup has 78% to all elemental resistances, and it has the 80% chaos resistance from Divine Flesh. The Incandescent Heart setup has elemental resistances at 75%, but it has 86% chaos resistance, which is a fairly low investment setup really for this particular defensive setup, because it's just the 5% from Divine Flesh, and then it's a 3% from a shield mod, and another 3% from a single Born of Chaos small cluster jewel. And lastly, the Transcendence setup has 78% to all maximum resistances. This is assuming a Lore Weave setup. And for this comparison, we're only really be looking at elemental damage taken. This is because the fourth VOW and Incandescent Heart setups have a lot of different room for additions to the build to be able to mitigate physical damage, and we're not really comparing physical damage here. It is worth mentioning that there is also another new mastery that is also an armor and energy shield mastery, and that is that 10% of physical damage from hits is taken as chaos damage. You can combine this with 10% of physical damage from hits taken as chaos damage from a Delve Helmet modifier, and then that can also have another 8% of the same modifier as an Eldritch implicit, for a total of 28% of physical damage from hits taken as chaos. This is an extremely effective way to massively mitigate a large portion of physical damage whilst using the fourth VOW or Incandescent Heart setup. So the first comparison is a large hit of elemental damage that has no penetration. So let's take a look at this first example. We're taking a hit of 20,000 lightning damage. The fourth VOW setup takes 2,200 lightning damage and 340 chaos damage, for a total of 2,540 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart setup takes 1,250 lightning damage and 1,428 chaos damage, for a total of 2,678 damage after all mitigations. And the Transcendence setup takes 1,364 lightning damage after all mitigations. You can see that against a pure elemental hit with no penetration, the Transcendence setup is far superior, and this is expected because the setup is using all of its armor to defend against that hit. The interesting thing here is just how competitive the Incandescent Heart setup is with the fourth VOW setup. But what about when we add penetration to the damaging hit? Let's take the same example, but this time the 20,000 lightning damage also has penetration of 20%. So we're taking a hit of 20,000 lightning damage with 20% lightning penetration. The fourth VOW setup takes 4,200 lightning damage and 340 chaos damage, for a total of 4,540 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart setup takes 2,250 lightning damage and 1,428 chaos damage for a total of 3,678 damage after all mitigations. Then the Transcendence setup takes 3,864 lightning damage after all mitigations. You can see now how much stronger the 4th VOW and Incandescent Heart setups become in comparison to the Transcendence setup when penetration is added. This is because a lot of the penetration is being ignored because that damage is being shifted into chaos. In this particular example, the Incandescent Heart setup takes the least damage. Alright, so what about a hit of damage that is split into multiple different damage types and also has penetration? Let's say we take a hit of 22,500 damage that is split into 7,500 of each element, cold, fire and lightning, and has 5% elemental penetration. The 4th VOW setup takes 1,012 damage of each elemental type and 405 chaos damage for a total of 3,442 damage after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart setup takes 562 damage of each elemental type and 1,653 chaos damage for a total of 3,341 damage after all mitigations. The Transcendence setup takes 344 damage of each elemental type for a total of 1,032 damage after all mitigations. There is 2 reasons why the Transcendence setup is particularly strong in this example. Firstly, the penetration is much lower than the previous example at only 5%. But secondly, and more importantly, when multiple damage types are taken, the full armor calculation is applied individually to each type. For example, in this scenario, in the Transcendence setup, each 7,500 damage will be mitigated first by the 78% respective resistance, and then separately mitigated by the 50,000 armor. This is also why the 4th VOW setup is very strong in combination with the Juggernaut's Unbreakable node, because you'll be mitigating half of the elemental damage through your elemental resistance, and then with the 8% of armor from Unbreakable, and half through chaos resistance, and then through 100% of armor in a separate calculation from the 4th VOW. Armor is far more effective at mitigating several smaller hits, so splitting damage is very effective. We should also briefly talk about damage over time. Let's say you're standing on a ground effect that's dealing 10,000 cold damage over time per second. The 4th VOW setup takes 1,100 cold damage and 1,000 chaos damage per second for a total of 2,100 damage per second after all mitigations. The Incandescent Heart setup takes 1,250 cold damage and 700 chaos damage per second for a total of 1,950 damage per second after all mitigations. The Transcendence setup takes 2,200 cold damage per second after all mitigations. It should be noted that the Incandescent Heart setup is likely to be the most effective at mitigating elemental damage over time, due to the fact that you can heavily invest into chaos resistance, and then half of that incoming damage is being mitigated by your chaos resistance due to Divine Flesh. Now, it is a little bit more difficult to show some examples using the Strength of Blood defensive setup, as this is kind of a mechanic that can be used in combination with any of these mechanics that we've just been talking about, or you could use it in a separate defensive setup of its own and use some other mechanics, but just know that Strength of Blood is a pretty strong keystone. I think it has a lot of use cases right now in this league, and I think it will have a lot of use cases in the future if Instant Leech and things like that are still a thing. And with the addition of more ways to leech and other leech modifiers being brought into the game, I think that keystone could become quite lucrative. But overall, I would just say that it's a very strong keystone and there's a lot of potential there. And that's it. Hopefully this was some useful comparisons here just to show the difference in these few defensive setups. Obviously there's so many defensive setups you can use in Path of Exile, but these 3 are kind of competing at the top there, I think, for different damage reduction setups, especially for the setups that actually kind of face tank hits, and not so much the setup that's on the right side of the tree that are very sort of evasive and avoiding damage. These are more like left side of the tree and kind of face tanking damage. well, they're all pretty effective, but hopefully this was helpful in shining some light on just how effective the Incandescent Heart setup in particular is and how competitive it is with the 4th VOW. I know a lot of people are talking about the 4th VOW right now, and obviously Transcendence has been a thing for a while, but yeah, just check out that Incandescent Heart setup. It's pretty damn good actually when you got that setup going. It's not very expensive to set that up. It's pretty similar overall to the 4th VOW. It just has a few extra passive points spent on the mastery, and it's pretty strong. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, click the subscribe button for more content like this in the future, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.